Despite the vast amount of TF2 content on YouTube, I haven't seen very many reviews covering the entirety of the game's weapon catalog. This makes a lot of sense considering the vast extent of all the available weapons. So, to remedy this, I'm going to review every weapon in the game as they pertain to the main casual game modes, starting with Scouts. I should also mention that I won't be going over every weapon set ad nauseum, as this is meant to be more of a comparative, qualitative analysis based upon my own experience in the game. I'm also going to propose some changes to weapons which I feel are considerably under or overpowered. Finally, note that some of the clips aren't all representative of each weapon as a whole. With all that out of the way, let's start with the primaries. The Scattergun is doubtlessly a contender for the best weapon in the game, although not in a vacuum. What sets the Scattergun apart is the phenomenal mobility of the Scout class. Boasting a movement speed of 133% with base, Scout can outrun and outmaneuver the entire rest of the cast. Likewise, with the Scattergun equipped, Scout can reliably 1v1 every other merc in many scenarios. The Scattergun is best used in short-range skirmishes where Scout can reliably maintain an optimal distance in order to maximize damage while still being able to dodge effectively.
Yeah, come get some, you frickin' wuss!
The Force of Nature is infamous in pubs as the miss 2 shots and runaway gun. However, the weapon is slightly more viable than some Giveth Scouts would have you believe, and a lot of fun to use. The main drawback of this weapon is also its most prominent feature, the knockback. Demo Knights will doubtlessly know the pain of landing a sword hit only for the would-be victim to surf the damage away to safety. The Force of Nature effectively has that as a built-in feature. This can make it very difficult to keep enemies in the Scout's damage sweet spot. Despite this flaw, the weapon can still be a blast to use. Close range shots will pop up targets for a devastatingly satisfying follow-up. Force jumping can also be a great utility when used correctly, and the knockback can often keep advancing classes at bay in a pinch. Overall, the Force of Nature isn't quite as viable as stock, but that still won't stop me from using it.
That's what I'm talking about!
For my money, the Shortstop is the most interesting primary sag grade, and the most difficult to rate given its disparity from Scout's other options. Essentially, the weapon's tighter spread increases Scout's maximum effective range. Because of this, I find it much easier to stay alive in certain situations. Additionally, I find it easier to close out on kills without switching to a secondary. However, the tighter spread also makes this weapon a bit trickier to aim, especially against opposing Scouts. As a factor of this, I find myself taking more time to line up shots, not taking full advantage of the increased fire rate. Overall, the Shortstop is a small step down in reliability compared to the Scattergun, but I would still consider it to be a viable alternative for some playstyles.
You knuckleheads ain't even worth the effort!
The Soda Popper is the only Scout side grade that truly gives the Scattergun a proper run for its money. There are similarities to the Force of Nature, but noticeably without the knockback effect, meaning it is usually more consistent in its burst damage potential. This alone would make the weapon a reasonable consideration for a primary. Where this weapon is actually insane is with the height meter. After about 350 damage, Scout can activate 5 additional mid-air jumps for 8 seconds. This makes dodging so effective, it's essentially a get out of jail free card, which also usually involves getting a kill or two on the way out. This is one of the few weapons in the game where I believe a nerf is actually warranted. Realistically, the active effect should be something more tame, for instance a reload speed buff. I would say that a movement speed buff is appropriate, but I feel that this may encroach on the design space with the Babyface's blaster.
Yeah, that's right.
Speaking of which, the Babyface's blaster. This weapon is perhaps the most disparaged of Scout's primaries, accountable for the fact that it often just feels awful to use. To start, the base movement speed feels sluggish and leaves the Scout uncharacteristically vulnerable. The user first needs to deal damage to even get back to normal speed. Furthermore, losing the speed boost due to chip damage is aggravating and feels totally unfair. Still, despite these drawbacks, I feel that the weapon is slightly underrated, at least on certain maps with enough open space to utilize the boost effectively. I feel that many people don't realize that Scout can actually use the pistol to reliably build up boost from a safe distance, which mitigates some of the weapon's downside. Still, losing your entire boost from some nominal chip damage usually outweighs the benefits of the gun. In my opinion, to go from being fun on certain maps to truly a viable alternative, I'd like to see a reduction in the boost loss on getting damage.
You are terrible!
I'd consider the backscatter to be the worst of Scout's primaries. Summarily, the only benefit of mini-critting backs at close range is heavily outweighed by the staggering downsides. Not only is having 2 fewer rounds a significant hindrance, but the 20% increased bullet spread absolutely cripples this weapon's effective range. The flanking playstyle this weapon encourages is viable or even optimal for the Scout. Users of this weapon would often be better off with just the Scattergun in these same scenarios. I believe that reducing, or even removing one of the two downsides of this weapon would bring it closer to a true consideration. The only saving grace I see in this weapon is the ease of quickly killing distracted heavies, although even this is marginal compared to the Scattergun.
Look at me, ma!
Scout's pistol is an excellent harassment and finishing tool. Like the stock Scattergun, it is consistent and reliable. Overall, it's an excellent gun. However, I still feel as though it's outclassed by the Pretty Boy's pocket pistol in the current form, which is close to a straight upgrade. The Bonk is easily Scout's worst secondary. In exchange for the reliable damage of the pistol, the user gains a gimmicky way to get behind enemy lines before more than likely dying if they tanked any sort of damage. Realistically, this is still the most viable way to break past hard choke points where flank routes aren't an option. However, the Scout isn't really the best class choice in these circumstances anyway. It can more effectively be used to get out of dangerous spots where death is the likely alternative, although I question if this is worth the secondary slot. In a perfect world, Scout could theoretically distract an annoying sentry while his team took it out, but I've never actually seen this done effectively in a pub.
If you order now, I'll throw in a second beating. Absolutely.
Like its primary sister, the Soda Popper, the Criticola is a distinct side grade from stock that pushes the power level of the slot. While active, the Purple Flurp drastically increases Scout's damage output and effective range, effectively eliminating the need for a pistol to harass or finish opponents. As a result, Scout's burst damage potential, especially paired with the Soda Popper, is immense. This is another Scout weapon that I consider to be too strong in its current form. Additionally, I find it a little tricky to consider an apt adjustment to the weapon while maintaining its identity.
Catch this!
The Mad Milk provides some excellent utility which aptly balances the loss of a pistol. In 1v1 scenarios, the healing can mitigate the lost damage output from the pistol. Its effectiveness in negating afterburn is another common upside, as the commonality of pyros in casual games means getting caught is basically inevitable. Finally, Scout's unparalleled positioning ability allows him to coat key enemy targets who Scout wouldn't otherwise be able to take on alone. This can entirely negate or prevent a potential push in the right circumstances.
I can see my base from here!
Winger is a viable pistol alternative which sacrifices some consistency on account of its smaller magazine for the added jump height utility. It allows the user to make certain jumps without the Atomizer, freeing up the slot for another option like the Rap Assassin. I personally find that the smaller magazine outweighs the benefits from freeing up this melee slot, but personal preference and playstyle play a role in this. Still, I feel like a slight accuracy buff would make this weapon more desirable to use considering the small magazine.
You morons are about to catch a real beat.
As I mentioned when introducing the pistol, I find that the pocket pistol is basically a complete upgrade. With good tracking, the entire magazine usually isn't necessary in order to close out kills, meaning the sole downside rarely comes into play. I also believe that the 15% firing speed buff is notably better than Winger's 15% damage buff because of the pistol's significant bullet spread. A greater number of slightly weaker bullets results in comparatively greater consistency. Finally, the health gained on hit is a cherry on top. While it will rarely get you out of otherwise fatal encounters, the healing can provide a nice cushion when retreating, making it very uncommon to die from distant chip damage. Given that the weapon has been reworked in the past and it doesn't really have a solid identity, I think that another rework would be in order. I'd propose a faster switch speed paired with lower damage and faster, potentially more inaccurate firing to be thematically appropriate for a pocket pistol, as it would trade mid-range harassment for short-range finishing. The stock pistol would therefore be a middle ground between this proposed change and the following secondary.
Yo, heads up!
The Flying Guillotine trades consistency for mid-range harassment and damage. The base 50 damage is significant, especially paired with the sequential 40 points of bleed over the next 8 seconds. However, the projectile nature of this weapon makes it inherently unreliable compared to hit scan. As a result, I find myself attempting to first land the cleaver before finishing the kill with my primary. Overall, it's definitely worse than the pistol, but it's still a fun and acceptable option.
Boink!
There is never a competitive reason to use the stock bat. Given Scout's effectiveness at close range with his other weapons, he is much better suited to using the various utility options at his disposal for the melee slot. It's still pretty fun to hit people with fish though.
Oh, there's my ball!
Not only is the damaging utility of the Sandman outclassed by the Rap Assassin, it also comes with the downside of losing 15 points of health. The benefit of the slow, so brief at reasonable ranges, is basically a non-factor. Removing the downside would likely have it still be outclassed by the Rap Assassin as a factor of raw damage, but the added panic option from the extra melee damage would at least make it a consideration.
Sweet!
While the explosive vulnerability from the Candy Cane is a good training tool, the ubiquitous nature of Soldiers and Demo Sentinels every casual match means the added sustain from the health pack is outweighed by the potential to be absolutely vaporized wherever you go.
Man, your skull's so soft. You're making this easy.
Despite being a staple of competitive TF2, the overbuilding utility from the Boston Batcher is rare enough to not particularly matter in casual. The inconsistency of melee hit registration can make this weapon a straight downgrade most of the time.
Hey, who's on fire now?
The Sun on the Stick is infamous for being terrible, but undeservedly so. The poor damage is essentially irrelevant, because you're basically always better just shooting an opponent even if they are on fire. But the 25% fire resistance can actually be a relevant upside when dealing with Afterburn following a bout against a pyro. Still, this isn't a huge upside, and it would probably be balanced or even viable at something like 50% resistance.
Oh, hey! You suck!
In casual play, a scout will almost always be better off just shooting an opponent in any realistic scenario rather than utilize this weapon. It essentially requires the player to sacrifice their mobility, the scout's greatest resource, by getting in the face of an enemy and becoming an easy shot. Don't use this in casual play.
Yo, batter up!
Finally come the two melee options which I consider to actually be viable. Of these two, I consider the Atomizer to be the premier option. It allows Scout to maneuver into otherwise unreachable positions and flanks without needing the winger, maximizing his overall effectiveness. For this reason, I almost always run this weapon in casual.
Hey, wimps!
The other viable option is the Rap Assassin, whose projectile can be used as a supplemental harassment and finishing tool. I find it very useful in conjunction with the winger in order to mitigate its smaller clip, as well as provide the movement not provided by the Atomizer. Finally, it can also be used alongside the Guillotine for an annoying amount of mid-range harassment. And that does it for all the weapons that Scout has. I hope you enjoyed the video. I've never made a video before, so this was a new endeavor. Let me know if I missed anything. If you think that, oh, Boston Basher jumping means it's top tier in pubs, or if the soda popper isn't actually as good as everyone says it is. I'd love to hear your opinions in the comments below. Thanks a lot.